Favorite books: The First Circle by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Russian writer who died about 10 years ago. Translated from the Russian by Michael Gibbon, Collins Fontana Books, 1970 is the copy I have. Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970. The book is set mostly in a political prison on the outskirts of Moscow in the time of Stalin. It's an insider's view of what life was like in such prisons. Solzhenitsyn knew only too well, having spent time in a range of Soviet prisons himself, years. All he had done was to criticize Stalin in a private letter, and he discussed organizing resistance to Stalin with a friend. He had served with distinction on the front fighting the Germans, but it was of no avail. He was thrown into a political prison. The translation is very good. There are some helpful footnotes. I could wish for more. It's also helpful that there's a list of characters at the beginning. The Russian names are hard to keep track of, especially when the text uses variants of them. There's a Wikipedia article if you look up Solzhenitsyn in Wikipedia. Here are some random quotes from the book. First, page 48. Thank God for prison. It has given me the chance to think things out. To understand the nature of happiness, we have to know first what it means to eat one's fill. Remember how it was in the Lubyanka and then when the security people were grilling us. Remember the thin barley or oatmeal porridge without a single drop of milk. Can you say you ate it? No, it was like Holy Communion. You took it like the sacraments. You ate it slowly, from the tip of a wooden spoon, entirely absorbed in the process of eating and thinking about eating, and it spread through your body like nectar. You quivered from the exquisite feeling you got from those sodden little grains and muddy slops in which they floated. And you went on living like that with virtually nothing to sustain you for 6 months or for 12. Can you compare that with the way people wolf down steaks, I mean? So there you just have people appreciating food, and it's worthwhile reading that because it makes you realize that you can appreciate what you've got. And that's a thing that Solzhenitsyn learnt the hard way. And then for a prisoner, one of the greatest joys on earth is to be allowed to relieve himself outside the regulation times, because in those prisons you're only allowed maybe 5 minutes at 6 a.m. and then 5 minutes at 6 p.m. Pretty awful. And here we have a pair of felt boots, page 690. Again, appreciating things that we take for granted. A pair of felt boots are the two best friends that a prisoner has. The most helpless of all living creatures, and with less influence over his own future than a frog, a toad, or a field mouse, a prisoner is completely at the mercy of the whims of fate. Even deep in a warm bed, a prisoner can never be certain that he will be safe from the horrors of winter that coming night, that he won't be grabbed by some uniformed arm and dragged off to the North Pole. Woe then to anyone whose feet are not shod in felt boots. He will leave his feet in the Arctic like 2 blocks of ice thrown off a lorry. Without his own pair of felt boots, a prisoner spends all winter hiding, living a life of lies and pretense, putting up with insults from the dregs of prison society, or else he turns informer, anything to avoid being transferred in winter. But the prisoner wearing his own felt boots has not a care in the world. He can look at the warders straight in the eye and take his orders smiling as serenely as Marcus Aurelius. Okay, now I'm going to read some of Solzhenitsyn's portrayal of Stalin himself. which is very interesting. If anyone, I suppose, was going to have insight into Stalin's mind, it would be someone like Solzhenitsyn. And it brings to mind another great Russian writer, Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, set in the time of the Napoleonic Wars. He has a depiction of Napoleon. So anyway, here's Solzhenitsyn's portrayal of Stalin. He was just a little old man with a wizened fold of skin on his neck, which was never shown in portraits. Breath that smelt of Turkish pipe tobacco, and thick, clammy fingers which left their mark on books. He had felt unwell today and the day before. Although the air was warm, he felt a chill on his back and shoulders, and had covered them with a brown camel hair shawl. So this is written about maybe about 1948-9, towards the end of Stalin's life, when he was an old man. He had nothing much to do and was enjoying himself by leafing through a small book in a hard brown cover. He admired the photographs, to which he kept returning, and read snatches of the text, which he knew almost by heart. The advantage of this book was its pocket size. It could go with people wherever they went. It had 250 pages, but it was printed in widely spaced, bold type, so that even the old and the barely literate could read it without strain. Its cover was embossed in gold, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, a short biography. The plain, straightforward phrases had an irresistible and soothing effect on the human heart. Strategist of genius, wise foresight, mighty will, iron determination. Lenin's virtual deputy from 1918 onwards. Well, wasn't he? The revolution's greatest military leader found the front in chaos and confusion. Frunze's operational plan was based on Stalin's order. So it was. It was our good fortune that in the difficult years of the war for the fatherland, we were led by a wise and tested leader, the great Stalin. Yes, they were lucky. Everybody knows the devastating force of Stalin's logic, the crystal clarity of his mind. Without false modesty, he had to admit it was true. His love for the people, his great concern for human beings, his dislike of pomp, his astounding modesty. Very true, that bit about modesty. Excellent, and they say it's selling well too. The second edition had run into 5 million copies, but that was not enough for a country of this size. There was still room for a third edition of 10 to 12 million. It should be sold direct in factories, schools, and collective farms. Okay, now skipping over a few pages to when one of Stalin's commanders visits him. I think this is one of the prison directors. Whenever he went to see Stalin, this strapping, powerful, decisive man experienced the same degree of terror which people had felt at the height of the purges whenever they heard footsteps on the staircase at night. The fear made his ears first turn ice cold, then flush with burning heat, and every time this happened, Abakumov's terror was increased at the thought that the redness of his ears might arouse the boss's suspicion. The slightest thing made Stalin suspicious. He hated it, for instance, if anyone in his presence put their hand into the inside pocket. For this reason, Abakumov always transferred his 3 fountain pens used for note-taking from his inside pocket to his outside breast pocket. The day-to-day running of the Ministry of State Security was in the hands of Beria, from whom Abakumov received most of his orders. But once a month, the autocrat himself, that's Stalin, liked to have personal contact with the person to whom he had entrusted the security of his realm. These interviews, which lasted about an hour, were a heavy price to pay for all the might and power with which Abakumov was invested. He was only able to enjoy life in between interviews. When the time for another one came, fear seized him. His ears froze. He handed over his briefcase to the orderly, Stalin's personal servant, without knowing whether he would ever get it back again. And as he waited outside the study, he bowed his ox-like head, never sure whether it would still be on his shoulders in an hour's time. Now skipping a few pages and just talking about Stalin again. He was an old man without any friends. Nobody loved him. He believed in nothing and he wanted nothing. He no longer even had any need of his daughter, once his favorite, but now only admitted on rare holidays. Helpless fear overcame him as he sensed the dwindling memory, the failing mind. Loneliness crept over him like a paralysis. Death had already laid its hand on him, but he would not believe it. And in fact, after Stalin died in 1952, there came a bit of a thaw in the Soviet Union when Khrushchev took over, and that was when Solzhenitsyn's first book, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, was allowed to be published. And that's the story of just one day in the life of a prisoner in a camp in Siberia. And that was published, and that's what made Solzhenitsyn famous. Later he published this book, The First Circle and the Gulag Archipelago, a very long book available in abridged versions, recommended by people like Jordan Peterson and many others as well, and very well worth reading just to see what happened in Russia at the time and how people were treated and how the spirits of the prisoners rose and how they discovered things like fellowship and satisfaction and even joy in prison. And in one place, Solzhenitsyn goes so far as to say that some prisoners believed that only prisoners had souls. People outside had no souls. They were so preoccupied with the world that they had never developed a soul. But in prison, you developed a soul. And certainly a lot of wonderful literature and very insightful words have come from Solzhenitsyn after his time in Soviet prisons.